Just a quick year in review here. So there were 30 pressure points pursued in the 2016-17 year. 12 were delivered, 15 were moved to the new working group structure, 3 were partially delivered, and on Monday when we had the Rosetta user group, it was agreed that those 3 would go back to the user groups to be revisited with a view to whether or not they need to be picked up again and continued or not. So there was enhancements all across the system through all of the, as we used to call, pressure points. So all of them: access rights, collection management, software security, ingest tools, preservation planning, consistency checks, and TA workbench. So from that point of view, there was a representation across the whole of our interests in the development of Rosetta. Effectively, and what I've done is I've said that the 12 and the 3 equal 15 because something was delivered. So effectively there was 50% delivered for this year. Those of you who are smart enough and really, really good at arithmetic will notice that there's a difference between my numbers and Ardi's numbers. And the reason is this: we didn't talk about what we were doing and how we were defining what was success, etc. prior to this. So we have our own interpretations, but they're pretty close anyway. They're within a level of tolerance, I think. So 50% is actually lower than what we've had in the last couple of years. And I'm going to argue that there's actually a really good reason why it was lower this year, because a lot of effort has gone into rethinking what the Rosetta user group will actually look like. So at our meeting last year, the conversation recognized that with the number of institutional and consortial members now over 250, we needed a different kind of approach to how we structured the working groups, the user group, that would actually allow us to incorporate a wider level of input across a wider range of community interests than we were able to do with what was much more ad hoc kind of approach. So an example of that ad hocness is we called them pressure points. So we called them pressure points so that we didn't have to think in any kind of manner that reflected ownership, responsibility, accountability, or anything like, or structural kind of approaches to dealing with stuff. It was just saying this stuff was important to us, and people could put their hands up to actually deal with them. So what we've been doing over the last year or so is working on a new terms of reference for the Rosetta user group. This was done in conjunction with Ex-Libris, Ardi in particular. So the basic premise is that all of the members of the user group, because it's still a small community compared with, say, Alma Primo, are going to be central to the ongoing growth of the Rosetta software over the next years. And the digital preservation program is probably going to become more and more central to our organization's activities as we move forward. And the ability to gather the input from everybody who makes up that community should give a lot of strength to how we think together about how we want to advance the systems, and also how we want to engage with Ex-Libris on what development enhancement looks like. And of course, so that it stays as closeable to best practice, et cetera, a lot of which we heard from William earlier on this morning. So the purpose hasn't changed enormously. It's been changed a little to kind of reflect the wider groupings and the wider interests of the community, but it's effectively to empower the Rosetta community, provide that connect between the Rosetta community and Ex-Libris, to be a vehicle for ongoing development and enhancement of Rosetta, crikey. Continue in partnership with Ex-Libris to the larger goal of furthering the cause of digital preservation and digital asset management. This one's really interesting because we haven't done this at all. So this one is kind of about how we get out into the wider community. And I've had a lot of conversations over the last 3 days, some sponsored by me, lamenting the lack of penetration of our message. And I think we've all probably had those conversations over the next 2 or 3 years. So there's an interesting kind of thing about what that means and how we can affect it. Expanding collaboration with other digital preservation practitioners, and a platform for the community to share experiences. So there's two primary roles that we think of that the Rosetta user group can actually play. One is a strategic role, so providing advice and guidance to Ex Libris on the direction and activities relating to Rosetta. There are places we cannot touch. An example of that is contractual obligations between Rosetta, Ex Libris, and customers. So those things aren't within our purview. But there are some things that we can talk about that actually we think would be useful to have a conversation about what the strategic direction for Rosetta should look like. The other one is a more operational role, so providing a forum for information sharing, working on analysis together, and assessing what the directions should be for Rosetta. Providing the practical and expert advice that we're starting to generate as a community of practice. So there's a lot of years here thinking about digital preservation, which is different to the same number of years that is spent on building Rosetta. So how we make those two things come a little bit closer so that we're actually responding to the wider community's requirements at the development level. A fairly obvious one there, that's ensuring that Rosetta development continues to meet the needs of the Rosetta community, and disseminating the workings and outcomes of the RUG as appropriate. This is another one where we have fallen down over the last several years. We've done very little dissemination of the thinking and the work that has actually been done within the Rosetta user group. So this is what we've come up with. The structure begins with the RUG membership. RUG membership is open to any customer of Ex Libris who are carrying Rosetta. So at the next level, we have a number of working groups, and the working groups are system operations, digital preservation, delivery and integration, and the Format Library Working Group. So the Format Library Working Group actually came out of the original digital preservation project. So it's an interesting move in maturity of the thinking about all of this, that the Format Library Working Group is now becoming part of the Rosetta user group and is joining up with those other activities. And then steering committee and chair, and an admin director, and I'll talk a little bit about these others as we go through. So a lot of the user group meeting on Monday was actually spent agreeing the roles, agreeing the persons that will take on those roles. So the result of that conversation was that working group lead for system operations went to Chad Barker from LDS Church. Stand up and take a bow, Chad. Yeah, that's the story. The delivery and integration working group lead is Dave Allen from State Library of Queensland. The working group lead for digital preservation is Michelle Lindlar from TIB in Germany. And the working group lead for the Format Library will remain Peter McKinney from National Library of New Zealand. The structure also includes representation at Igloo and Eluna. So the Igloo representation will remain with Matthias Gross, who's been undertaking that role for the last several years. And the Eluna representative will be Teresa Solo from Getty, who's been doing that on an informal basis for the last several years. The chair has been nominated for Kirsty Smith from National Library of New Zealand. So as we could see here, there was this notion of an administrative director. There is a sense that with a more structured way of running the user group, we actually need to be a lot more rigorous about the processes that we use around the management, the documentation, the interactions between everybody, getting all the working groups doing what the working groups need to do, making sure that all the documentation that has to get developed in terms of requirements is done in a timely fashion to meet the development and roadmap timetables of Ex Libris and all of that kind of stuff. So there was a general acceptance within the group on Monday that this was a good idea. There was less acceptance of how it should actually be affected. So what we're going to do is see if we can find an organisation, and Ross Spencer has, where are you, Ross? They're hiding, okay. Offered to take this back to Archives New Zealand to see whether or not Archives New Zealand will do a trial of this admin director type role for a year, so that we will then have a more evidence-based sense of what the costs are and what it would mean to actually bring an administrative role more into the Rosetta user group as a whole. So the steering committee comprises the chair, an admin director possibly, Ex Libris product manager, the 4 working group leads, the IGLU representative and the Eluna representative. So some discussion points arising from the RUG meeting and some conversation that we, some of which we hope to have with Ex Libris before the day is out. And it's interesting, you'll see some stuff here that you'll recognise from earlier conversations. Idan's already told us about the strengthening of the new processes and that they're looking to put in place, and an expectation that the visible diminishment in quality in the last 12 months or so will see something completely different, hopefully, in the next 12 months. So it was good to hear some of that. We need to have a conversation about the release timetable and some of those kinds of things so that the user group can have a formal pathway into that. The conversation about ideas exchange and the Rosetta user group, Adi brought this up just before in his presentation. So we need, all of these points actually just came out of the meeting on Monday, so there were sort of topics for conversation for the steering committee with Ex Libris. So it was around how the balance might work between the user group and the ideas exchange. Adi gave a view before that it may be that weightier things happen in the working groups and that less weighty things happen in ideas exchange. On Monday we considered the possibility of looking through ideas exchange and seeing what kind of things could be propelled forward by the working groups. So we just need to formalise how we're going to actually kind of work that through and what the management of that will look like. For the 3rd year in a row, the issue of the Rosetta user group and relationships with IGLU and Eluna came up. The last 2 years, we've had very robust conversations within the Rosetta user group about what this means and what it would look like. There has been a resounding no to becoming a Rosetta product working group. So there is, this has come up again this year, and the question is becoming from the perspective of the user group's discussion on Monday, the issue is not necessarily becoming a product working group within IGLU/Eluna, but actually what are the opportunities to leverage the Rosetta user group and IGLU and Eluna so that the benefits that they each provide to their communities can be realised, but maybe there are maybe some synergies there that we can actually leverage as well. So there's further conversation to happen with that. And that's what we did on Monday. What do you want to talk about? Lunch.
guess I have to ask, has anyone reconsidered and thought about the potential of an administrative director role and would also offer to go back to their institution to find out if they can have someone who can support them? Was there a hand up there?
Only yours, Ross.
We're the community, right? And we want this. So people do have to step up. And I am happy to go back to archives and do that. But it's kind of disappointing that that's one voice in a very large room.
It's probably not an unreasonable challenge, Ross. I think with what's happening here and with the increase in numbers, we're seeing not just an increase in the size of the community that's involved in terms of thinking about a Rosetta user group, we're actually also talking about an opportunity to become a much more mature grouping and hopefully a much more effective grouping. So there's levels that we can influence that maybe happen here when in fact we should be happening here. There's a lot of commentary. William started out this morning talking about we're still locking our conversations around pronom and droid and things like that. And there are obviously reasons for that. But if we can become stronger as a community in the way we think about the activity that we're trying to promote, then maybe we can actually lift the bar around the conversation that we're having. Not only with Ex Libris in terms of being the Rosetta user group, but also on a more broad scale. So there's possibly a challenge there.